We're in Brussels today and we'll start on time. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of MasterCard, I'd like to welcome you to this edition of Politico's Playbook Breakfast with Commissioner Vestager. I'm looking forward to what promises to be a very enlightening and entertaining interview. Having seen some of Ryan's previous work, I'm sure you'll all agree with me. I'm particularly excited today, as you know, not only do we have Commissioner Vestager with us today, but as the current EU Competition Commission, some have said that she is one of the few commissioners that wield real economic power across the continent and beyond. And it's no secret that MasterCard itself has felt that power too. But through these competition powers, the Commissioner Vestager also significantly contributes to the future ecosystem in which European and non-European businesses will operate. This will be important to achieving the objectives of the European Commission. Firstly, boosting growth and generating jobs. Competition policy strives to create the best environment for consumers and businesses in order to interact in an efficient manner and on a level playing field. Now, this is particularly true as new services and solutions come to market that aim to make our lives easier, and as they emerge, it's crucial for regulators to get the regulatory framework right for businesses to understand the role in which the competition law plays and how to adapt in a fast-changing environment and how this will all apply to new services. Now, digital in particular is interesting in this regard. And the rise of mobile and the way consumers and business put a lot of emphasis on mobile is very important. It's an important way in which we interact with each other, not only on a personal level, reaching out and interacting with friends, but also from a business context, how we connect with each other as colleagues and with our clients. This is why the digital single market the European Commission is seeking to establish is so important. Now, when we talk about MasterCard, MasterCard is a technology company that operates in the payment space. We are not a bank. We do not issue credit cards. We do not issue debit products. What we provide is technology, and technology that makes these payments possible. This technology connects consumers, it connects businesses, it connects retailers and travel agents. And we aim to provide the most convenient, safest, and secure payment options to our consumers and our businesses that we work with, whether they're online or offline, and we do this across the globe. Being able to let consumers choose is an absolute critical element in terms of the payment methodology and how they wish to interact with the retailers and businesses that they want to do business with. Being able to let the consumer choose is absolutely critical in this regard as well. And what we want to see at MasterCard is a seamless and integrated shopping and payment process that allows the consumer to sort of transact in whichever way they will, regardless of the device or wherever they are in the world. And this is the power of what technology brings today. Now, for us to be able to meet these consumers' needs, to provide a better consumer experience, we need regulators to provide a robust and clear and legal framework. But with that, I'm not here to sort of espouse my thoughts. I'm conscious that you're here to listen to this great interview we're about to sort of engage in. So without further ado, Ryan and Commissioner Vestager, thank you very much for your time here today.
Excuse us while we climb up here. Good morning, everyone, including to all of you watching online, and welcome to this third Playbook Breakfast. And good morning, Commissioner.
Good morning.
I think we've undoubtedly got one of the most interesting and powerful people on stage this morning, but that's enough about me. I think we're here to talk about Commissioner Vestager, the commissioner who moves markets, who holds geopolitical strings, who inspired a TV series, and still has time to bake for her colleagues. So I think on that note, Commissioner, can you tell us, do your colleagues and friends, do they ever get annoyed that you seem so perfect?
No, since they know me.
Okay, fair answer. I think you're also someone who prides yourself on being quite normal. And we see that in all your activities, we see that in how you tweet. But you're also someone who ran for parliament at 20, you ran your party at 25, you were a minister at 29. It must be quite an effort to keep grounded when you've got these two tracks going on in your life, basically.
Yes, but I remember it was very, very early, and I was running for parliament, but it was without any risk of being elected. So I could just go ahead and test it. And then one of the older, sort of, really big people in my party said that when he was done being a minister, he wondered what those long yellow things were doing in the streets. They were buses. And then I decided that this is never, ever going to happen to me, that I don't know where to buy the bus ticket or which would be the most convenient bus to take going from A to B. Because if you have the ambition to influence other people's lives, then I think it's only fair that you do your best to share that life.
A very good point. And now, speaking of sharing lives, your parents, they were both Lutheran pastors. And at 29, in your first ministerial gig, you were put in charge of the Danish state church. So you became your parents' boss at the age of 29, basically. How did that go down at family dinner?
Well, I think it happens in every family eventually.
The daughter becomes a minister. Okay.
No, that the children take charge, because I guess that is the rhythm of the generation, that eventually the children has to take responsibility. Well, since it was of course it was a home in a vicarage, a sort of very, very classical with a big tree in the middle of the yard, etc. But it was never sort of. It was never that religious. So basically, it was never such that my father sort of clicked the glass and say, now we are going to discuss whatever in the New Testament. And therefore, being the Minister of Ecclesiastical Affairs sort of never was an interference in their lives.
Now, we've also got a situation where I feel like it's history repeating itself in a way. I look at some of the criticisms that observers make of you, and they will say, oh, she's anti-American, or she interferes in the markets too much. And in a past life, I worked with your predecessor, Nelly Cruz. And we'd have people like the Wall Street Journal putting pictures of her as a socialist cowgirl, lassoing the silliest American beastly company that was nearby. And so I just feel like it's the same sort of criticisms coming back. But whose fault is that?
But I think that comes sort of with the inherent roles. I don't think it's, and I don't take it personally, because there is a love-hate relationship between the EU and the US, which goes back centuries. I was just reminded about it yesterday because there was sort of an inauguration of the piece of the Berlin Wall with Kennedy's face on it by the Berlaymont. And then again, one of the things that Schäuble mentioned was how the US and the Europeans have had also a relationship during very, very, very critical times on our continent. And therefore, I think it's not basically to do with us. It's much bigger. Not only sort of the criticism, but also that there is a profound understanding of some very common values.
Yep. And to tie those two threads of the discussion together, because you're subject to so much scrutiny, like I think you place a premium on being thorough and paying attention to detail. And you also place a premium on having this balanced life. And so a lot of people would say, how do you manage to keep on top of the details? Like, what is the method you use to both be rigorous but not sit there until 2 o'clock in the morning at your desk?
Well, I think another thing that I learned from my parents was that they never kept office hours. Their door was always open. So like 5 in the morning, we could hear a car coming in the gravel, and it was very tired father who was going to hand in the birth registration papers. Or very late at night, someone would call and be in very dear distress. So they basically always worked, but they also enjoyed an enormous flexibility in their lives. To do sort of the old private thing here and there, and in that, getting a balanced life. Not a work-life balance, but sort of taking responsibility both for what they did professionally and what they did privately. And that, I think, for me, is a very good example to try to follow. because I think you get stress if you have your mind on the office hours instead of the work that you want to do.
Yep. And I look at the sort of cases that you're handling, and we don't need to go into details in the cases, and I know that will annoy all of the lawyers in the room, but it's not a bad thing sometimes, is it? So I look at the case list and I think like Google, Gazprom, Apple, Starbucks, Fiat, all these huge companies. But I just think, when are you going to stop pussyfooting around? When are you going to go after some of the big guys out there?
Well, what you see is, of course, only the tip of the iceberg.
That's a warning, folks.
No, but the thing is that I think a lot of the work we do also with smaller companies, not necessarily on global markets, but on EU-wide markets or regional markets. It's very important also to show that we also care if a small and medium-sized business is having a problem with competitors colluding in not allowing him or her into the next market. And that, I think, is not very well known, because these cases never sort of get the headline. And maybe that's just the way it should be, but I think it is as important to make sure that in our list of priorities, we also take on cases that are not sort of headline material, as the cases you just mentioned.
Yeah. And how do you go about that prioritization? Where, for example, we saw yesterday there was a big fuss around the steel industry and concerns about dumping and big imbalances in that market. So how did you sort of choose to focus on issues like tech and telecoms and media, rather than digging around and finding a sector like steel that needed to be looked at?
Well, sometimes the world set our priorities. They do that, for instance, in mergers. And that is, I think, it's a good sign that that businesses want to merge to a completely different degree now than just 5 years ago. So we have mergers in cement as well as in telco, in coffee, as well as in the financial markets. So basically you get, and I think that is extremely privileged, a very full picture of what goes on business-wise. And then, of course, we also rely very much on people knocking on our doors and say, this cannot be right. There must be a reason why this is not working. And then, of course, we start looking, start asking questions, and sometimes that's enough to do the trick, not necessary to open investigations.
And how much have you found that the reactive work, the information that flows up to you from DG Competition, the companies that come knocking on your door, how much of that is a factor in your day-to-day work versus the sort of big picture strategic questions or ambitions that you had when you came in? Essentially, what's changed since you arrived in the post?
Well, since it's for the business sector to choose when to merge, and since it's for member states to decide if they'll set up a new scheme, and it's for investigators to find catalysts, then my priorities has to do with the way we work and the goals that we want to achieve. Because I think if the work that we do can contribute to Europeans feeling that they live in a continent that is just a little bit more fair, that if you do an effort and you have a good idea, then you also have a fair fighting chance. And I think in trying to do that, that of course also is reflected. But not to say that now it's all steel or it's all telco or it's all something else, but to say the way that we work things, to tell people we live in a union of law and we will fight for putting the values of our treaty into everyday life. Equal treatment, mutual respect. The law is for the small as well as for the big.
Yeah. And is that your contribution to the team? And I make the observation that you've got effectively the most extraordinary sort of independent investigative or almost executive powers in your role. And yet there are huge issues out there at the moment this year, whether it's been Greece, now it's the migration crisis. And there's not an obvious way for a competition commissioner to attach herself to the migration crisis, for example. But is it this fairness, living the values of the treaty that brings you into the team, or do you have other ways of doing that?
But it's still a college. And I'd say especially the refugee crisis has brought a a very profound discussion in the college, because when we discuss how to make the energy union work or develop the capital market, very often it becomes quite technical. How to make this work. It's about energy efficiency, security of supply, what have we. It's about different kind of capital market products, etc., etc. But when it comes to the refugees, sort of the sentiment and the emotions in the room and sort of the historical picture that we see ourselves in, that's beyond concrete portfolios. Because all of a sudden, Europe is tested, not for speeches or rhetorics or anything of that sort, but whether or not we will stand up for people who might otherwise be killed.
Yeah. So you have real unscripted debates in the college about...
Yes.
Yeah.
I know. Can you do this breaking?
Of course, of course. We
Great.
can do anything you want. Now, maybe another example of where those issues of fairness or bringing the union's value to life comes together with your portfolio is the tax issue, where I think there's a lot of people who they feel like the system is not working for them. And then, of course, you have companies that the economy depends upon and which growth depends upon. If they're not able to function, then ultimately you can't deliver any of that other fairness or progress. So how do you make something like the tax task force work? You don't have to tell us how many cases there's going to be or when they're going to happen, but how do you keep that machine ticking over to make that contribution?
Well, first of all, I think the work is very much driven by sort of very basic aims, because there are so many good, substantial reasons to do business in Europe. The internal market, more than 500 million customers, reasonably well regulated, uncorrupt, secure, etc., etc. But to come here alone because that you pay less taxes than your competitor, well, I think that's for the wrong reasons. And you have seen so many people watching their governments do surprising things to get in control of not only their spending but also their revenue. Cutting benefits, lowering salaries, hiring personal income taxes. They expect, of course, that every business contribute. Not only the thousands and thousands and thousands of businesses who just do the right thing, but also the businesses who might have spent resources on tax evasion. And I think that is a great motivator to do the job, because it is, of course, very complicated, takes a lot of work, takes a lot of detail, and therefore I think it's important to have sort of a goal of substance in front of you.
Yeah. And so in that sense, is it not about the numbers? I mean, you must get annoyed at people waiting in anticipation for some huge fine or some big billion-dollar thing to come thumping down on the table. Is it, in a sense, not about the numbers, but about sending a market signal? You've spoken occasionally about the need to send market signals. Is that one of the factors behind your work there?
Well, maybe it's because I'm from a small country, but to me, 20, 30 million euros, it makes a difference, at least by the end of the month. But I think the real takeaway from the two cases of Starbucks and Fiat is sort of by principle, that there are limits as to how remote transfer prices can be from market prices. Also, because we know from our probe of tax rulings in all member states, that some member states, they just get it perfectly right. Not a finger to be put, not a question to be asked.
Which ones are they?
They're all doing very well. Well, unfortunately, it's not my own home, but there are a number, yeah, and we'll come back to that.
Okay, okay. One of the things we do to liven up the Playbook Breakfast is we do a bit of rapid-fire questions, a sort of yes, no, or very short answer. So I wanted to turn to action movies, which you're known to love. Have you seen Spectre?
Yes, twice.
Daniel Craig or Pierce Brosnan?
Neither. Ooh. I am much more Roger Moore.
Oh, okay, controversial. That's breaking. Die Hard 1, 2, or 3?
Actually, I find that 4 was great. because
I got put out there. I forgot about the fourth
I kind of like the sort of the man machine. Also because
Okay.
it's so surprising that he always wins in the end. I love that.
If I were to open your fridge right now, what would I be shocked by?
Oh, hopefully nothing, but you would find 2 chickens ready to be roasted as dogs, because on this evening we eat duck in Denmark, and I couldn't find a full fresh duck, so they're all ready to go in the oven.
Now you run. What sort of runner are you? Are you a daydreamer, or are you one of those people who runs around with a little thing on your arm, sort of telling everyone on Facebook how many kilometers you've run?
I would never tell, because I'm way too slow and I'm way too competitive to admit that. But I think it's a very good opportunity, you know, to get the last word, if you didn't get it when you actually had the conversation, and to keep up with the latest music, and to get the inspiration for the next speeches or the next initiatives.
Okay. When you're not running, is it biking or walking?
Walking.
Walking. And finally, what stereotype makes you most angry?
Stupid man.
Okay, I've been put in my place. So now if we might look, you're someone who really values the present. That's something I've noticed in the research I did for this interview. So I wanted to look now a little bit at the past and a little bit at the future. And if we look back at the time that you spent chairing the ECOFIN meetings when the Danish held the presidency, I think it's generally understood that you chaired those meetings well, that you were seen as a good negotiator. And I wanted to get your sense of whether that's a transferable skill to this role, or whether it's a whole new skill set that you face as you try and negotiate with companies, or even still bring those negotiations more into the public view compared to your predecessor. What's your feeling about the difference between those jobs?
Well, I think to be a good negotiator, first of all, you have to be able to listen very carefully, and to put your own preferred solution in the back, to be able to find a solution that will work for every participant in the negotiation. And I think doing that is a skill that you can use everywhere. Also when you plan vacation in your family or whatever you do. And I think that there is a very good reason for the fact that the ears is the only part of the human body that keeps growing. So what I take from that is that the older you get, the more you should listen.
Okay. Thinking of listening then, what was the best advice that you received when you were shifting into the role and becoming commissioner? And did you take it?
Well, I have a problem of taking advice. Because I learned very, very early on that basically by the end of the day, it's your responsibility. It's not the advisor's responsibility, it's your responsibility.
Okay. So you listen to advice rather than commit to taking it?
Yes, I listen to advice. And some of the good advice I have been listening to over the years is to try to listen to the people actually in charge, or those who really do the job. I very much enjoy to get a case presented by the case handler, of course with the manager on the side and senior management, etc. But to know, is this person or these persons who actually do the casework, have they been thorough? Yep. Can I see in their eyes that they are absolutely certain about the facts that they get here? And I think that works very well for me.
Okay, that just reminds me of another question. There's these weekly jour fixe meetings. So basically when the commissioner and the teams get together from all the different parts of the DG. Do you go to them in the Madhu Tower, or do they come to you?
I go to them.
Aha, okay, very interesting. Now, thinking ahead to the future, you said recently that you wanted national competition authorities to sort of play a stronger role, let's say. I think you're consulting on it, so we won't prejudge the consultation. But what's the thinking there? Why do you want to boost the role of the national authorities?
Well, I think that there is a risk for the citizens to live in a member state where the competition authorities do not have sufficient independence and sufficient tools to get the job done. And therefore, it depends of the member state whether or not there is strong competition law enforcement. And I think it shouldn't depend on the member states. It should depend on sort of the real job being done. And the team has been very thorough in analyzing what are the tools and the status of authorities all over member states. And for instance, one of the things that they have found is that some authorities are limited in their ability to take on board digital evidence. And you know, it's not only sort of the right side of the business that digitalize, it's also the catalyst side. Yeah. They also have their things in the cloud. They also have prepaid subscriptions, etc., etc. So to make sure that the toolbox has the sufficient tools, to make sure that there are sufficient independent decision making, I think that could be a good thing. And still, of course, making room for the national way of doing things, who should be the national authority, how should that be organized, but just to have the basics.
And one of the new tools in the box really is a developing private enforcement system. So for those of you who aren't following competition on a daily basis, that, you know, for want of a more complex description, it's class action lawsuits, basically. And that's one of the reasons why the European system or European enforcement is a little different to the US, because we've had fewer tools in the toolbox here in Europe. So as that system develops, do you think it will change the priorities or how you prioritize?
Well, I think that still remains to be seen, because it is very, very new. It's just being transposed as we speak into national legislation, and it still remains to be seen how it will work. But that also makes it obvious that we will follow it very closely to make sure that we get this new tool of our law enforcement and private damages at the same time. Because I also think that it will work as a deterrent, which it should.
And we touched on your parents being pastors. And one connection that only occurred to me last night, actually, was that your new Director General, Johannes Leitenberger, is also the son of a Lutheran pastor. And you grew up just across the border, the Danish-German border, from each other at roughly the same time. And so I started it's terrible, I started going to bed dreaming whether you finished each other's sentences or not.
No, since we both talk a lot, it's not possible.
I can vouch for that, he does talk a lot. We should move sort of soon into the audience questions, but it's obviously David Cameron's big morning this morning, and it's not for any of us here to say what the British and the British people will do. But obviously one of the things that keeps popping up in those discussions is the Danish model, how Denmark relates to the EU or opts in and opts out. As a Dane, a Great Dane, are you able to sort of elaborate a little on the pros and cons of how Denmark has chosen to associate to the EU?
Well, 1992 was a great year because we won the championship. And I think that is still what we sort of celebrate of 92. Because the Danish relationship with the rest of Europe has in some respect, of course, made us lean forward in order not to be sort of on the fence, sitting there looking in, but to take part, because we should defend the interest of not only Danes, but also the part that we play in Europe. But it has worked well for us. We have a referendum coming up to have the same sort of opt-in clause as the British are having right now. And I think it's very difficult to compare notes, because Denmark is a very small open economy, with a business structure, with sectors in different balances, different even than Sweden. Not to speak about the UK or Germany. And therefore I think it's very difficult to take a lesson learned from back then till now. Okay.
Well, why don't we turn to the audience and see if they have any lessons or questions. I know that you follow all these issues very closely, so I want to make sure that you get a chance to speak as well. So, microphones are in the seats, and we've already got a question right here in the middle, sir. Why don't you go first?
Well, Commissioner, if I can go back for a
Oh, your microphone's just next to your chair. Yeah. Yeah. And if you're representing a company or an organization, if you could say who that is as well.
Stefano Stefanini, Atlantic Council. Something that must, I guess, bother you, since you said yourself that tax rulings are legal under certain conditions, and obviously when tax rulings are faulted, both parties, the company and the state, are at fault. The result is that though the fine is slapped only on the company, and the state finds itself in a situation where it's a win-win situation for the state, because it has made the tax rulings and it gets the money. Of course, these are the EU rules, but don't you think it's a flawed system in this respect? The state too should be punished.
Well, first of all, you're right in saying that basically it's not a fine. It is the unpaid taxes to be paid. And state aid has been working like this ever since the beginning of state aid control. So it also goes if a government is handing out a subsidy, then you basically have the same situation. If it's not legal, then the state has to recover this subsidy that it obviously would like to give. So as I see it, being still relatively new in my position, sort of the state aid thinking is that it's the embarrassment and the inconvenience of having to recover that is one of the deterrents in state aid. I think maybe it's important to take the discussion when it comes to taxation broader and out of state aid alone, because I wouldn't know, as we speak, how to distribute a tax revenue to member states where profits were made, because the tax base are very different, and it would be sort of very tricky to figure out what taxes should actually have been paid in whatever member state this business has been active. So therefore, it is not for the competition portfolio specifically, because our ways of working has been tested also in the courts over the decades. It is a much broader debate which has to do with looking forward. Will we have a common corporate tax base? Will we have more transparency? Will we, to a much larger degree, see that value is taxed where it's created? And in that, I think there is a debate which is open for many more people than just people interested in competition issues.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Harriet. I work for the Dutch Shipbuilders Association. I have a question and I need to describe it.
Yeah.
Better?
Yeah.
Good morning. My name is Harriet. I work for the Dutch Shipbuilders Association. I do have a question on a certain case. I need to describe the context very shortly first. Several European shipbuilding countries filed a complaint against Spain in 2010 concerning the so-called tax lease system. DG Comp banned this system in July 2013. We were, of course, very happy because the level playing field was finally restored after a lot of hard work from our side and the Commission side. However, after Spain made one or two seemingly small changes, DG Comp approved a similar system called Tax Lease 2. And unfortunately, Tax Lease 2 has the same effect as the banned system. So unfortunately, we are back in the same old situation where the level playing field is gone and the market is distorted. So don't you think it is undesirable, or it should be undesirable, that DG Comp approves a system which is just as distortive as the system which was just banned before?
Well, I can't answer it specifically because I don't know the case, nor the one that was banned, nor the system that was approved. And it will always, anyway, be the responsibility of the Commissioner and the Commission in charge. Because, of course, DG Comp does the casework, analyzing it, getting data on board, getting the facts right, but it is still the responsibility of the Commission. And therefore, of course, there are always an opportunity to come back and say that the latest Commission got this wrong. And of course, I think that is the way it should be, that if one thinks that the Commission has taken a wrong decision, well, then it should be appealed. Then one should go and say, this is not as it should be. And I think I see some colleagues here who might have that experience of meeting the legal service in one of our courtrooms. Because that is, of course, what is needed always to make sure that the checks and balances are in place.
Okay. I think Matthew Newman has a question.
Good morning. Morning, Commissioner. Matthew Newman from MLEX. Just turning to one of the high-profile cases you've been looking at since you arrived, and that's Gazprom. You inherited this case from Commissioner Almunia, and you've also worked hard to resolve it. In the past year and a half, we've seen a dramatic fall in the price of oil. One of the issues that you've brought up is this indexation for natural gas, and that's linked to the price of oil. And back in when it started several years ago, the oil price was quite high, and now we've seen more than half of the value has been lost. Does that change the way you look at the case, or is it still a problem with the overall formula? Because obviously people are paying less for natural gas now, just mathematically, as the price of oil goes down.
No, it doesn't change the case, because one of the things that we question is the way that oil indexation is made. Not that you cannot have oil indexation as a matter of principle, you can do that, but then it depends on how it's done. So basically it has nothing to do with recent development of oil prices. And of course, and I think that's a more general development, what we see is that we get a more and more sort of real gas market, because you have gas hubs, and therefore it sort of gets its own independent in the price making. But precise or exactly on the oil indexation and the changes of the oil prices, it doesn't change a thing.
Alec, I think you were next.
Yes, good morning. Alec Burnside, Cadwallader. Ryan, you said earlier that the lawyers in the room would be disappointed if you didn't ask about particular cases. In fact, this lawyer at least is delighted that you didn't ask about particular cases. It's the likes of Matthew who press about individual cases. Commissioner, my humble congratulations on how little you say about cases in the public domain while managing to communicate so fully about the portfolio. You talked, Ryan, about bringing more into the public view than your predecessor. Your predecessor brought many things into the public domain about individual cases. Would you share with us a little your thought about how you balance the expectation of communication on the one hand with your responsibilities, which a lawyer would call quasi-judicial, of fairness, not only towards the media, but also towards the European Parliament, for example, which feels that it has some sort of democratic role and insight into the application of competition policy, which would be simply extraordinary in a country which didn't have the curious situation that we have of a competition regulator sitting in a political body?
Well, first of all, I decided very early that as far as I could help it, not to talk about cases. Because when would then that stop? Should you then, what details shouldn't you share? Sometimes, of course, this is very tricky because I would like to tell about the portfolio. I think there is an important job to be done to do the advocacy for competition. So I try to manage, respecting that basically there's very, very little to be said. Most of it is very few details of processes, but then, of course, when there is a decision, then to talk about that. The decision in itself, the takeaway from that decision, what could be learned from the concrete casework. And doing that instead of talking about the process, because I think there is a lot of risk in doing that, about how the market will react, how the case will progress, if there isn't a public debate about the casework in itself. With the European Parliament, I have what we call a structured dialogue. I was just in the Ikan committee yesterday. I very much appreciate it because I get a very sort of broad spectrum of questions, and it also gives me an insight as to what is the priorities of the Ikan committee. Now the public consultation may show otherwise, but it will be my aim to involve the Parliament as a co-legislator when we talk about the national competition authorities, in order to get their legislative approach also on these issues, which I think is of crucial importance, because we could not do without the national competition authorities in getting the job done. And then as well, what I experience is that we share to a very, very large degree both the values and the aims of competition law enforcement, Commission and Parliament. And the work done, for instance, by the Taxation committee, I think it's very professional, it's very good, and also, which I very, very much appreciate, very supportive to the Commission approach to the tax cases.
I think we've got time for a couple more questions. Is there anyone up the back? I notice we've been really focused on the front in taking your questions. Yes.
Hi, I'm Penny Noss with UPS. I have a question on something you said earlier. I can understand why you'd prefer Roger Moore over Pierce Brosnan, but I do question Roger Moore over Daniel Craig, and I wondered if you could explain.
Well, you know, I think the real world is very, very bad. It's basically a very troublesome place that we live. So I enjoy humor and irony and the simplest possible plot and a good car chase. And of course I realize that it's very nice and complicated and feelings and everything, but we have so much of that already. So let's have the real thing and let's have fun just for an hour or two.
So you're not a Speedos fan then?
Fast and Furious, maybe.
Okay, okay. Yes, sir.
What about Sean Connery?
Oh, but he's in a different league.
We're going to have to relabel this Bond breakfast in a minute. Okay, let's have one more policy-related question and then head off to coffee.
It was you who started.
Who's going to take the bait? No one's going to take the bait. Okay, well then let's ask one final question from me. You know, let's imagine you're in charge of marketing for the European Union. It's been a tough year. What's the slogan, or what is the pitch that you're going to make to have people fall back in love with the European Union in 2016?
Oh, I don't think they should. I think they should fall in love again with their husband, or I think you should reserve that kind of feelings for the very important things in your life. But if I were to choose a slogan, it would be "It's all about people." When I grew up, a lot of the visionaries of the European Union, they were talking about interinstitutional relationships and treaty change. And I think it was only because I was very enthusiastic that it didn't turn me off completely. Mm-hmm. Because I think it is very important to show that we're here because we have the privilege of being able to influence the framework of people's lives. And if we can enable people to be able to pursue their dreams, not because we have chosen the crisis, but because we choose to take the responsibility of trying to help, then I think we can get a different dialogue going. Because what I fear is that you would find parents all over Europe wondering if their children will have a better life, or even the same as they have been able to have themselves. And over the decades, this has been the history of Europe, trying to make it better for the next generation. And I think that should be our aim, to say together we can actually make that happen, that we can bring that hope back in for young people to get an education, to get a job, to be able to start and provide for a family. Because this is everyday life, and it's great.
On that note, Commissioner, thank you very much for joining us.
It was
I think
a pleasure.
we owe a big round of applause.
Thank you.
Now, I know you have to run off, but David Cameron will give his big speech, I think, in around about 10 minutes, if my internal body clock is working. And so I invite you to take a coffee and a croissant now. And for anyone who does want to come in and watch the speech and participate in a short discussion afterwards, we'll keep it going in here. And thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. Seize the moment, seize the day.
Yes, it's truly a great idea.